A 16-year-old boy runs through the Virginia timber. His shirt is stained with blood. His hands are shaking. Behind him, somewhere back in a clearing, another young man lies motionless on the ground. The boy's name is Simon Kenton, but before long he will abandon that name, because in this moment he believes he has just killed a man. He does not go home to explain himself. He does not wait to see if the man wakes up. He sees only one thing in his future: a rope, gallows, and a murder charge. So Simon Kenton runs. He runs from his home, from his family, runs from his name, and runs west. That decision, made in a panic, will send him into one of the most violent, unforgiving, and legendary frontiers in American history. He would become a hunter, a scout, a spy, a soldier, a prisoner, and a survivor. He would stand beside men like Daniel Boone and George Rogers Clark. He would fight in Lord Dunmore's War, the American Revolution, the Northwest Indian War, and the War of 1812. He would help defend Kentucky, guide settlers through dangerous country, survive tortures at the hands of the Shawnee, and earn a reputation as one of the hardest men on the early American frontier. And yet today, Simon Kenton's name is often buried beneath men like Boone and Crockett. But maybe it shouldn't be, because if Daniel Boone became the symbol of the Kentucky frontier, Simon Kenton was one of the men who helped hold that frontier together, with nothing but courage, instinct, endurance, and a rifle. This is a story of Simon Kenton, the runaway boy who became one of the greatest frontiersmen of early America. Well, let's get into it, shall we? My name's Steven, and welcome to Wild West Deep Dives. Simon Kenton was born on the 3rd of April, 1755, in Virginia, in what was then the rough backcountry of colonial America. According to Legends of America, he was born in Fauquier County to Mark Kenton Sr., an Irish immigrant, and Mary Miller Kenton, who was of Scots-Welsh descent. Mark Wilcox from Emerging Revolutionary War places Kenton's birth in the Bull Run Mountains, noting that Kenton later remembered his mother saying he had been born, quote, in the April before Braddock's defeat. Either way, Simon Kenton came into the world on the edge of settlement, in a place where survival depended less on schooling and more on strength, endurance, and knowing how to live off the land. His family was poor, and like most poor frontier families, there was little time for formal education. Kenton helped on the family farm, but he never learned to read or write, and would remain illiterate for the rest of his life, only learning how to sign his name. But Simon Kenton was not built for books, he was built for the woods. Jim Cornelius from the Frontier Partisans podcast, who helped me a great deal with this episode, describes Kenton in his book, Warriors of the Wildlands, True Tales of the Frontier Partisans, as tall, strong, athletic, and fleet of foot. A young man with tremendous physical ability, but not much interest in putting that ability into the endless labor of an 18th century Virginia farm. He was not necessarily lazy in the sense that he lacked energy. In fact, he had plenty of it. The problem was that he preferred the hills, forests, and hunting grounds to the field. If he was put to work, all it took was a moment for someone to turn their back, and Simon was gone, headed to the woods. There, away from the farm, he came alive. He loved shouldering his gun, wandering the timber, and testing himself in the wild country around him. In a video from the Woodland Escape, Peter Kelly describes Kenton as a young man who became an excellent marksman, someone far more comfortable in the brush with a musket than behind a plow. And physically, he was already becoming the kind of man frontier legend would remember: tall, broad-shouldered, powerful, and hard to handle. Then came the event that changed the course of his entire life. Around 1770 or 1771, when Simon was about 15 years old, he became infatuated with a young woman named Ellen Cummins. Unfortunately for Kenton, she was promised to another young man, William Leachman. According to Mark Wilcox, opportunities for poor farming families to gather and socialize were rare, so when the wedding day came, the meeting house was full. Simon showed up angry, humiliated, and unable to let it go. Some accounts say he was bare-chested when he challenged Leachman to step outside and settle the matter. Leachman accepted, but it did not go well for Simon Kenton. He lost his girl, and he lost the fight. In front of the whole settlement, the older Leachman beat him badly. For a proud teenage boy, it was more than just a beating. It was public humiliation, and Kenton did not forget it. A year passed. Simon was now older, stronger, and still burning with resentment. One day, his father sent him over to the Leachman farm to borrow a saw. Simon and William Leachman ended up walking together along a wooden path, and Kenton saw his chance. In a clearing, he suggested they settle the matter again. The two began to fight, and Kenton soon realized he may have overestimated himself again. But during the struggle, he managed to maneuver Leachman near a small sapling. When Leachman went down, his queued hair became tangled in the branches. Unable to get away, Leachman was trapped. Then Simon Kenton unleashed everything he had been carrying for a year. He beat Leachman savagely, pounding him with his fists until the rage finally drained out of him. When it was over, Leachman was lying motionless, blood coming from his nose and mouth. Simon tried to revive him, but Leachman did not wake. In that moment, panic took hold. Simon believed he had killed a man. He saw the gallows in his mind. He knew what happened to murderers, so he ran. Kenton fled into the forest, the same forest that had always been his refuge. But this time, he was not just escaping farm work or chasing adventure. He believed he was a fugitive. He hid through the night, and by morning, he had made his decision. He would leave home. He would go west. Mark Wilcox notes that Kenton had an uncle, Thomas Kenton, who worked as an Ohio River Indian trader out of Fort Pitt. Thomas had told stories of the Shawnee north of the Ohio River and the country south of it, a place sometimes described as a middle ground, a vast hunting country filled with game and cane fields. Simon had wanted to see that country for himself. Now, believing he had killed William Leachman, he had both the desire and the desperate reason to go. According to Wilcox, Kenton began his journey west hatless, shoeless, wearing only a shirt and rough linen pantaloons stained with blood, which he tried to wash away with leaves and water. Peter Kelly gives the image another way. A frightened 16-year-old boy running home, grabbing his musket, shooting bag, and powder horn, and vanishing toward the frontier. It is worth stopping on that image for a second. This was not yet the legendary frontiersman. This was not yet the scout, soldier, spy, Indian fighter, companion of Daniel Boone, or survivor of torture and captivity. This was just a teenage boy who thought he had killed a man in a jealous rage, and when he imagined what justice would do to him, he chose the only road he could see. So, he went west. After fleeing Virginia, Simon Kenton's life became a westward apprenticeship. He was still only a teenager, and he was traveling on foot through a dangerous country. According to Mark Wilcox, Kenton stopped at farms and settlements along the way, sometimes asking for food, but more often having to work for it, chopping wood or whatever labor he could in exchange for a meal. By the time he reached Warm Springs, Virginia, he had already walked well over 100 miles. There, he met a miller named Jacob Butler, who took him in, gave him work, and helped outfit him for the wilderness. Before Simon moved on toward Fort Pitt, Butler saw that he had the things a young man needed to survive on the frontier: a long rifle, a powder horn, and a shot pouch. Kenton also left with something else from that place, a new name. For the next several years, he would be known as Simon Butler. This was not just an alias, it was protection. If Simon was caught under his real name, he feared he would be taken back to Virginia and hanged. So Simon Kenton became Simon Butler, and under that name, he began to make his way in the country along the Ohio River. He hunted, trapped, learned to read sign, handle himself in the woods, and survive in a world where a man's life could depend on noticing a bent blade of grass, a broken twig, or the faint mark of a moccasin in the mud. Jim Cornelius describes his arrival at Fort Pitt in August of 1771 as the beginning of that transformation. Butler had left Virginia in a panic, but by the time he reached the forks of the Ohio, he was better equipped, better supplied, and already becoming something more than a frightened runaway. From there, he attached himself to hunting parties that moved down the Ohio, trapping, trading, and living by their rifles. He also worked as a guide for surveying parties laying out western land claims for powerful Virginia speculators, men with names like George Washington and Patrick Henry. This was the reality behind much of the frontier movement. Hunters, scouts, and settlers may have seen adventure, land, and freedom, but behind them were land companies, political ambitions, and wealthy men hoping to turn the West into profit. But Simon Butler's early years in the West were not just romantic wanderings through game-filled forests. They were brutal. In the late winter of 1773, Simon and two companions were drying their wet clothes near present-day Charleston, West Virginia, when they were surprised by a Shawnee attack. One of the men was killed. Butler and the other survivor escaped, but they escaped with almost nothing. No clothing, no food, no rifles. For about a week, they wandered down the Great Kanawha River, suffering from cold, hunger, and exposure, before finally reaching the Ohio River, where they were found by mountain men and given help. That experience would have broken some men. For Simon Butler, it seems to have only hardened him. After recovering, he continued hunting along the Ohio and searching for the rich cane lands he had heard so much about, the almost mythical Kentucky country that had already drawn men like Daniel Boone beyond the mountains. By 1774, the Ohio frontier was sliding toward open war. Tensions between white settlers and native peoples had been building for years. Settlers, hunters, traders, and land speculators kept pressing into contested ground. The Shawnee, Delaware, Mingo, and other native peoples had every reason to see that movement as an invasion. Jim Cornelius points to the murder of the family of the Mingo leader, Logan, by Jacob and Daniel Greathouse and his men as one of the moments that helped ignite Lord Dunmore's war. What followed was a short but bloody conflict between Virginia forces and native nations of the Ohio Valley. Simon Butler served as a scout and courier for the Virginia militia during that war. It was during this period that he met men who would shape the rest of his life, including George Rogers Clark and another frontier figure whose name would later become infamous, Simon Girty. Girty had been captured as a boy and raised among the Seneca. During the American Revolution, he would side with the British and native nations against the American rebels, and frontier settlers would come to curse his name as that of a renegade. But the older, simpler version of Girty as nothing but a monster does not tell the whole story. Cornelius notes that Girty was complicated, troubled, and certainly no saint, but he also understood native people, respected them, and more than once intervened to save captives. For Simon Butler, that friendship would one day mean the difference between life and death. Lord Dunmore's war ended after the Battle of Point Pleasant, where Virginia forces defeated a native coalition near the meeting of the Great Kanawha and Ohio rivers. The result forced the Shawnee to accept the Ohio River as a boundary, with native tribes remaining north of the river and white settlers pushing south of it. But that peace was fragile from the start. Within a year, it began to break down, and the Kentucky country would become one of the bloodiest borderlands in America. Like many young hunters of his generation, Simon Butler was drawn down the river by stories of a paradise called Kentucky. Rich meadows, cane fields, salt licks, and game in almost unimaginable numbers. Daniel Boone had entered Kentucky years earlier, and in 1775 helped open the Wilderness Road through the Cumberland Gap. That same year, Simon Butler came into Kentucky by floating down the Ohio with a partner named Thomas Williams to Limestone Creek. There, the partners began claiming land and planting corn, but farming had never been Simon's calling. He might claim land, and later in life he would claim thousands of acres, but he was not going to spend his days in a field. He left Williams behind and ranged through the country, doing what he was born to do: hunting, scouting, guiding, and exploring. But Kentucky was not empty. It was a hunting ground, it was contested ground, and white settlers were coming in through Boone's Wilderness Road and down the Ohio River. The Shawnee still crossed the river, raided the settlements, and fought to resist the loss of their country. At Blue Licks, Simon and Williams encountered two settlers named Fitzpatrick and Hendricks. One of them wanted help returning to the Ohio, so Simon guided him back, while Hendricks stayed behind at camp. When Simon returned, he found the camp destroyed and Hendricks dead, his body burned in the ashes of the fire. The death of Hendricks haunted him. According to Cornelius, Butler carried guilt over his death for the rest of his life. He believed he should not have left an inexperienced settler alone in such dangerous country. From that point on, Cornelius argues, Simon Butler began to see his purpose differently. He was no longer simply a hunter or wanderer. He became a protector of Kentucky settlers, a scout, guide, spy, hunter, and frontier warrior. By 1775, Butler had made his way to Boonesborough, Kentucky, where he worked as a scout for the settlement. For the next few years, that would be his world, slipping through the timber, watching for Shawnee war parties, carrying news between the stations, and bringing in meat when men were afraid to leave the safety of the forts and cabins. Legends of America notes that he was often encountering native warriors during this period, and by the spring of 1777, he was at Boonesborough when one of the most famous stories of his life took place. This is one of those moments where we have to be careful. The story of Simon Butler saving Daniel Boone has been told in different ways, and some versions may have been more polished legend than strict fact. But the core of the story, that Butler helped save Boone during an attack at Boonesborough, appears across multiple accounts. In April of 1777, Boonesborough was under threat. According to Mark Wilcox, Chief Blackfish and roughly 200 Shawnee warriors had crossed south of the Ohio and were launching attacks against Kentucky strongholds like Harrodsburg, Logan Station, and Boonesborough. The settlers inside Boonesborough were tense and crowded, and men had to leave the fort in small guarded groups to work the fields. On the morning of the 24th of April, Boone sent men outside to investigate after the cattle refused to go out to the pasture. Simon Butler stood near the gate with his long rifle in hand. Then shots rang out. A Shawnee party fired from cover, and one of the men outside the fort was shot down. Warriors rushed forward to scalp him. Simon Butler moved out, drew a bead, and shot one of the attackers dead. Boone and several others then rushed out in pursuit, but it was a trap. Like so many stories of the American West, the Shawnee used a few warriors to bring out the larger force in order to ambush the main body. Just then, more Shawnee appeared, cutting the men off from the fort. Boone reportedly shouted for the men to fight their way back, and in the close struggle that followed, he was hit. A ball shattered his ankle and brought him to the ground. A Shawnee warrior moved in with a tomahawk to scalp the legendary frontiersman, but Simon fired and killed him. Then, when another attacker came in and there was no time to reload, Simon used his rifle like a club and struck him down. With the fight still raging, he grabbed Daniel Boone, heaved him up, and carried him back toward the gate through the gunfire. Boone was no small man, but Simon Butler was tall, powerful, and driven by the sort of strength that appears again and again in these frontier stories, and got Boone inside the fort. Later, from his bed, Boone praised him with a line that has followed Simon ever since. Quote, "Simon, you have behaved like a man today. Indeed, you are a fine fellow." For a young fugitive still living under an assumed name, that must have meant something. Daniel Boone was already a towering figure of the Kentucky frontier, and to hear those words from Boone was no small thing. It was a kind of acceptance, a recognition that Simon Butler was not just a runaway boy anymore. He had become a man of the frontier. As the American Revolution widened, the Ohio Valley became one of the most vicious theaters. This was not the revolution of neat lines, grand armies, and famous speeches. This was a border war of raids, ambushes, burnt cabins, stolen horses, and scalping parties. British officials from Fort Detroit supplied and encouraged native allies, hoping to use pressure on the Kentucky settlements to weaken the American rebellion in the West. The Kentucky settlers, in turn, saw native resistance as a part of the British war effort and fought accordingly. In 1778, Simon joined George Rogers Clark's campaign into the Illinois country. Clark's goal was to strike British outposts and weaken British influence among native nations in the Old Northwest. Jim Cornelius notes that Butler scouted for Clark in a campaign against Kaskaskia and Cahokia, and later spied out Vincennes along the Wabash. The campaign was important, but it did not end the war in Kentucky. Fort Detroit remained untouched, and Shawnee raids continued. Simon did not remain with Clark for the whole campaign. Cornelius notes that Butler tended to operate on his own hook, following his own instincts rather than anyone else's orders, a phrase that came up again and again while researching Simon Kenton Butler's life. He returned to Kentucky with news of Clark's victories and resumed his usual work as scout and hunter, but he soon found himself in the worst danger of his life. The Shawnee knew him. They knew him not as Simon Kenton, but as Simon Butler. Or, in their pronunciation, something like Bodler. He had become a known enemy, a skilled long knife warrior who scouted, fought, and protected the Kentucky settlements. To capture him would bring honor, to kill him would remove a dangerous foe. The term long knife was originally used by the Iroquois and later by the Mingo and other native peoples to distinct Virginia settlers from other settlers from places like New York, Pennsylvania, etc. That chance came when Simon and two companions, Alex Montgomery and George Clark, not the General George Clark, they crossed north of the Ohio to steal Shawnee horses. Horse raids were common on the frontier. Both sides did it. Horses were wealth, transportation, military advantage, and survival. At first, the raid went well. The men managed to drive off a village's horse herd and head back toward the river. But high winds churned the Ohio, and they could not motivate the horses to cross. Rather than abandon the stolen horses, they followed the river, looking for a better crossing. Then everything collapsed. They ran into a Shawnee war party on its way to join a major attack against Boonesborough. The frontiersmen scattered. George Clark escaped by jumping in the river and clinging to a floating log. Simon crashed into a canebrake, trying to lose his pursuers in the thick growth, but mounted warriors cut him off. A Shawnee warrior named Bona chased him into the cane, brought him down, and tied him up. And I'm sorry if I'm mispronouncing Bona. Soon after, Montgomery was killed, and warriors returned carrying his bloody scalp. They tied Simon to a tree and whipped him against the face with it. That was only the beginning. The Shawnee did not treat Simon the way they had treated Daniel Boone when Boone had been captured earlier. Not to say Boone was treated well. Boone had run the gauntlet and survived it. But Boone had been adopted by the Shawnee, but had later escaped and returned to the Kentucky settlements. If you're wondering what the gauntlet is, the gauntlet was a brutal ritual in which a prisoner had to run between two lines of people armed with sticks, clubs, switches, stones, and anything else they could use to strike him. Many captives did not survive it. It was a brutal test of one's physical and mental strength. For Simon Butler, he was a known enemy, a horse thief, and a hated frontier fighter. The Shawnee tied him naked and backward onto one of the stolen colts, placed a halter around his neck, and lashed the animal into a thicket. As the colt bucked, branches tore Simon's legs, feet, face, and body. If he had lost his balance, the halter could have hanged him. After that, he was taken on a grim tour through Shawnee towns. At village after village, his captors displayed him and forced him to run the gauntlet. Simon was forced to run it again and again. Most accounts say he ran the gauntlet 9 different times. Each time he was beaten, battered, and left wounded, but each time he survived. The Shawnee named him, bear with me here as I will probably say it incorrectly, Cuttahota, meaning the condemned man. At one point, Simon tried to escape, but he was run down by a horseman and struck in the head with the butt of a tomahawk. The blow may have left a permanent dent in his skull. His situation became even more helpless when the women of Wampatomica began striking a stake for his execution by fire. By then, Butler had every reason to believe his life was over. But then, his old friend Simon Girty appeared. Girty, now aligned with the British and native forces, recognized his old friend. According to Jim Cornelius, Girty embraced him and pleaded with the Shawnee to spare him. Butler later remembered Girty's reaction with deep gratitude, saying Girty was overjoyed to see him and begged the native leaders to save his life. In Butler's own memory of it, quote, "Yes, Girty was good to me." For the moment, Girty succeeded, but the danger was not over. When another raiding party returned from Kentucky badly beaten, they were furious to see the man they called Butler alive and walking around the village. They demanded a trial, and Simon was condemned yet again. Girty then used delay as a strategy. He convinced them to move the execution to Upper Sandusky, buying enough time to send word to the British at Fort Detroit that a valuable prisoner was about to be burned. On the way, Butler suffered still more. Bona, angry and frustrated, broke his arm with a club. In another village, a man recognized Butler as the one who had killed his son during a raid in Kentucky and attacked him with an axe, gashing his shoulder and breaking his collarbone. By the time Simon reached Upper Sandusky, he was battered almost beyond recognition, but help arrived before the fire was lit. Peter Drouard, a British trader, reached Upper Sandusky and used both the authority of the crown and a gift of trade goods to secure Butler as a prisoner of war. Instead of being burned, Simon was taken to Fort Detroit. There, a doctor treated the mass injuries he had suffered. Some accounts describe Butler being exchanged as part of a prisoner trade in June of 1779. Others, including Cornelius, describe him escaping from Fort Detroit after receiving help from sympathetic people there. Either way, the result is the same. By the summer of 1779, Simon Butler returned to Kentucky. He was no longer the runaway boy with blood on his clothes. He was one of the hardest men on the American frontier. After Simon returned from captivity, one of the greatest burdens of his life finally began to lift. For years, he had lived as Simon Butler because he believed he had killed William Leachman back in Virginia. But around 1779 or 1782, depending on the account, Simon learned the truth. William Leachman had survived. In fact, because Simon had disappeared after the fight, Leachman himself had apparently fallen under suspicion for Simon's murder. From that point forward, Simon Butler could become Simon Kenton again. But even with his true name restored, the war on the frontier was not over. The Revolution may have been moving toward its conclusion in the East, but in Kentucky and along the Ohio, the conflict remained vicious and personal. Raids, counter-raids, horse stealing, burned cabins, ambushes, and retaliatory expeditions continued. In 1780, Kenton again served under George Rogers Clark in a campaign against Shawnee towns north of the Ohio River, including Chillicothe and Pickaway. Then, in 1782, came one of the bloodiest moments of the Kentucky frontier, the Battle of Blue Licks. British Rangers and native warriors, with Simon Girty and other British agents involved, had laid siege to Bryan Station. When they could not take it, they retreated. A Kentucky force pursued them and was ambushed at Blue Licks. In a matter of minutes, roughly 17 Kentuckians were killed, including Israel Boone, Daniel Boone's son. Jim Cornelius notes that Simon Kenton was part of the relief force that reached the battlefield too late to save anyone. All they could do was bury the dead. Blue Licks was one of the last major engagements of the American Revolutionary War, but for the people living in Kentucky, it must not have felt like an ending. It felt like proof that peace on paper did not mean peace on the ground. After the Revolution, Kenton returned to Virginia for the first time in years. According to Mark Wilcox, he had not seen his family in about 12 years. He persuaded several family members, including his parents, to come back west with him to Kentucky, where he could provide them land. But his father, Mark Kenton Sr., was old and in poor health, and he died along the way in Pittsburgh. Kenton then established himself near Limestone Creek, close to present-day Maysville, Kentucky. He built a blockhouse there and founded Kenton Station. Over time, he made a practice of meeting new settlers coming down the Ohio River and guiding them safely inland to his station and other settlements. He also surveyed and located lands for various land warrant holders, often taking a portion of the claims as payment. In this way, Kenton acquired thousands of acres of Kentucky land. Some he kept, some he sold, and some he deeded to new arrivals. For a time, Simon Kenton became a wealthy and influential man. Jim Cornelius describes him almost like a frontier warlord, not in the cruel sense, but as a protector, provider, and local power. He had a fortified station on the Ohio. He had a fine brick house built. There was a grist mill and a tavern that brought in revenue. He kept people supplied with meat and helped secure the river frontier. But the violence continued. By 1786, raids into Kentucky had increased. Horses were stolen, isolated families were killed or taken captive. Some Shawnee parties lured flatboats full of settlers to shore and then attacked the people aboard. The danger threatened travel along the river. In response, Kenton raised what became known as Kenton's Boys, an independent group of spies, scouts, and Minutemen who could respond quickly to raids, pursue stolen horses, rescue captives, and strike back when needed. This was no formal army. There were no neat uniforms, regular payrolls, or official muster rules. This was Kenton operating the way he always had, on his own hook. He chose the men, trained them, led them, and when word came that horses or people had been taken, he and his boys packed some parched corn and jerky, grabbed their guns, and went after the trail. For about 8 years, Kenton's boys fought skirmishes, rescued captives, and recovered stolen horses and cattle. The full extent of what they did is impossible to document because no proper records were kept. But Cornelius points out one telling fact. Kenton Station, though one of the most exposed stations on the Ohio River frontier, was never attacked. Native raiders avoided Kenton like he was a frontier boogeyman. The long war for Kentucky effectively ended after General Mad Anthony Wayne's campaign in the Northwest Indian War. Some accounts say Kenton fought under Wayne and took part in the Battle of Fallen Timbers in 1794, but Mark Wilcox gives a more cautious version, saying Kenton served under Wayne, but missed the climactic battle because of illness. Either way, Wayne's victory at Fallen Timbers helped break native military power in the region and marked a turning point in the struggle for Kentucky and Ohio. Then tragedy struck at home. Martha Dowden Kenton died in a house fire in 1798. After her death, Kenton remarried. His second wife was Elizabeth Jarboe, and together they would have 6 children. In 1799, Kenton and Colonel William Ward led a group of families from Mason County, Kentucky, into the area between present-day Springfield and Urbana, Ohio. Kenton had seen the Mad River Valley years earlier while he was a prisoner of the Shawnee, and he had reportedly vowed that if he survived, he would one day return there, and now he did. By 1810, the Kentons were settled in Urbana, Ohio, and Simon had become a man of tremendous local respect. He was eventually given the rank of Brigadier General in the Ohio State Militia, but peace brought problems Kenton was not built to handle. He had been almost perfectly suited for the violent frontier, brave, generous, strong, loyal, fearless, and independent. But land titles, courts, debt claims, legal contracts, and business dealings were different kinds of battlefields. Kenton was still illiterate. He was also trusting, generous, and in a world increasingly ruled by paperwork, lawyers, and complicated land laws, those traits cost him dearly. Mark Wilcox notes that because of those loose land laws, disputed claims, and sometimes non-payment, Kenton's land holdings in Kentucky and Ohio began to fail. In 1811, lawyers came to Ohio from Kentucky to collect on a debt Kenton believed was not legitimate. When he refused to pay, he was arrested under the Old Debtors Law and placed in the Urbana jail. Then came one of the stranger, more revealing moments of his later life. The people of Urbana respected Kenton so much that they elected him town jailer, effectively making him his own keeper. He had the freedom of town and walked where he wished, now carrying a walking stick instead of a rifle that had once defined him. He served about a year before being released, but the record does not show whether the debt was ever paid. By then, Kenton had also undergone a personal change. Jim Cornelius writes that he, quote, got religion during the waves of revival that swept through the backcountry in the early 19th century, but history was not finished calling him. When the War of 1812 broke out, Kenton was already an older man. He was in his late 50s, but when Kentucky Governor Isaac Shelby marched through Urbana on his way to join William Henry Harrison's army, Kenton joined the campaign. Mark Wilcox says Kenton admitted he had no official military function. He simply went along, take a wild guess, on his own hook, just as he had done so many times before. In 1813, Kenton fought at the Battle of the Thames, the battle that broke the power of Tecumseh's confederation and saw Tecumseh himself killed. And here we reach one of the most powerful legends connected to Kenton's later life. According to several accounts, after the battle, Kenton was asked to identify Tecumseh's body. He had encountered Tecumseh before and reportedly respected him. Seeing that American soldiers were eager to mutilate Tecumseh's remains and carve souvenirs from the body, Kenton is said to have deliberately identified another fallen native leader, Roundhead, as Tecumseh. In doing so, he may have spared Tecumseh's body from desecration. Whether that story is true is difficult to prove. Jim Cornelius frames it as a legend, and that is probably the safest way to present it. But true or not, the story says something about how later generations wanted to remember Kenton, not just as a warrior, but as a man who could respect a great enemy. The Battle of the Thames marked the end of Kenton's military life. After that, he lived more quietly, though not easily. Around 1820, he moved to the Zanesville, Ohio area. His final years were marked by poverty, land disputes, and the consequences of poor money management. Legends of America notes that he survived on a government pension of $20 a month, roughly $569 today. There is something deeply sad about that. Simon Kenton had helped open Kentucky and Ohio to settlement. He had guided families, rescued captives, fought through wars, survived torture, protected stations, and earned a reputation as one of the greatest woodsmen of the frontier. At one point, some accounts suggest he may have controlled an enormous amount of land, some 500,000 acres, and yet, like Daniel Boone, he lost much of what he had gained. The frontier rewarded men like Kenton in reputation, but not always in comfort. In old age, Kenton also formed friendships with members of the Shawnee, including the Spybuck family. Cornelius makes a point that old warriors often had more in common with one another than they did with the civilization that grew up over the lands they had fought across. In 1836, at the age of 81, the legendary, larger-than-life frontiersman, Simon Kenton, died in Logan County, Ohio. He was first buried at New Jerusalem, and in 1865, his remains were moved to Urbana. Then in 1884, the state of Ohio placed a monument at his grave. His tombstone carries a simple inscription, "Full of honors, full of years." And that may be the best way to leave him. Simon Kenton began as a poor, illiterate Virginia farm boy who had ran west because he thought he had killed a man. He became Simon Butler, a runaway with a rifle, a false name, and no real future except the one he had carved out of the woods. He became a hunter, scout, spy, guide, soldier, prisoner, torture survivor, frontier protector, militia general, and old man of the borderlands. He was famous in his own lifetime, but later faded behind names like Daniel Boone and Davy Crockett. Mark Wilcox notes that without a handful of people, including 4 of Kenton's children, his story might have been almost entirely forgotten. But Simon Kenton's life belongs in that same rough company, because if Daniel Boone became the symbol of the Kentucky frontier, Simon Kenton was one of the men who bled for it, guarded it, guided families through it, and somehow survived long enough to watch the violent world of his youth become farms, towns, courts, roads, and memory. A runaway boy became one of the greatest frontiersmen of early America, and by the end, he was exactly what his stone said he was, full of honors, full of years. Now before I end this episode, at one point Simon Kenton referred to a fire you can make underground, one that produced no smoke, no visible flames, but still gave off plenty of warmth. And for all of my wilderness survivalists listening out there, no, I'm not talking about the Dakota fire hole. And just to be clear, I am not one of those survivalists. I've hunted plenty, I've spent time deep in the woods and in the wilderness of the West, and I have started my fair share of fires. But I am by no means a survival expert, and unlike Simon Kenton, I wasn't also hiding from the Shawnee, so you can be sure that I have all of the gear that I could possibly need before I head out. But I dug into this a little bit, and while I couldn't find anything absolutely concrete, it appears Kenton may have learned this trick from another frontiersman named John Yeager. Some claim the method traces back even farther, possibly to the medieval period. According to this story, Kenton built this underground fire, covered both the fire and himself with a blanket, leaned back against an oak tree, and slept comfortably through a winter night while out on a scouting mission. So how did it work? You'll have to use your imagination a little bit here. First, you dig a hole in the ground. Shocking, I know. Then you start your fire with whatever dry wood you have available. Kenton reportedly used white oak. Once the fire is burning well, you take 2 larger sticks and place them upright in the fire. Then you cover the fire with soil, pack it down, and remove the 2 sticks, leaving behind 2 air pockets. Those air pockets allow the fire to keep breathing underground without giving off the same visible smoke or flame. And apparently, when Kenton woke up in the morning, he was still warm. I watched 2 great videos on this from Waypoint Survival and Frontier Quest on YouTube. I'll leave the links to both of them down in the description. Definitely check them out if you're interested, because it really is a fascinating little frontier trick. I also want to give a huge shout out to Jim Cornelius from the Frontier Partisans podcast. Go check out the podcast and also go check out his book, Warriors of the Wildlands, True Tales of the Frontier Partisans. He was a huge help with this episode, along with all the other sources I've mentioned. I hope y'all enjoyed this episode on the legendary frontiersman, Simon Kenton. If you did, please give a thumbs up and subscribe. And if you're listening on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, or anywhere else you get your podcasts, please give a 5-star rating and leave a review. I always love hearing from y'all. Join the Wild West Deep Dives family. For just $1, you'll get a membership that gives you access to bonus content like the first stagecoach robbery in U.S. history. Thank you all for the recent support. I can't thank y'all enough. We will see y'all next time, and remember, when in doubt, shoot straight, shoot fast. God bless.